Hi, boys and girls. Welcome to your Thursday math lesson. Today's lesson is going to be a review for Module 13. We're going to review everything we've learned about fractions so far. Today's I Can objective reads, I can read, write, and identify fractions using models on a number line and on a ruler. And you can find the module review on page 381. Before we get to the module review in your books, I want to review a few problems from yesterday's Nearpod activity. I did see a few mistakes, so I want to go over some of the problems. Let's take a look at the number line on the left hand of your screen, and we're looking for the point marked by the red arrow. Okay, before we can determine what point is marked by the red arrow, we need to first figure out what our unit fraction is, or what we're counting by. So I start at my 0, okay, and end at my 1, and the first thing that I'm going to do is count how many equal parts there are in one whole. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4 equal parts in one whole. That tells me that my denominator is going to be a 4, or I'm counting by fourths. Okay, so that means that each one of those parts has a unit fraction of 1/4. Okay, now I'm ready to go back into my number line and label my number line. I can start at 0, or 0/4. My first jump will be 1 part out of 4, or 1/4. My second jump will be 2/4, 3/4, and then 4/4, which I know equals 1 whole. So the red arrow marks 1/4 on the number line. Okay. Let's look at number 2. We have a similar number line. We start with a 0 and we end with the 1. And I'm going to count how many equal spaces are between 0 and 1. Now, one of the common misconceptions is that students count the lines instead of the spaces between. So I have students counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and that'll give them a unit fraction of 1/6, or they'll think that they're counting by sixths. Okay, we want to count how many parts there are in one whole, so we're actually going to count our jumps on our number line. So we're counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's 5 equal parts in one whole, so I know that I'm counting by fifths, and my unit fraction is 1/5. Each part equals 1/5. So now I can go ahead and I can label my number line. I start at 0, or 0/5. My first part, or my first jump, is 1/5, then 2/5, 3/5, 4/5, and finally 5/5, which I know equals 1 whole. Okay, let's look at number 3. What fraction tells the distance between each mark on the number line? So I'm being asked for the distance between each mark. So the distance between that. Before I know that, let's again look at our 0 and our 1, and I know that it's 1 whole. And let's find out what we're counting by. So I have 1 part, 2 parts, 3 parts, so I know that I'm counting by thirds. Okay? And if I know that I'm counting by thirds, then my unit fraction for each part is 1/3. So the amount of space between two marks on the number line is 1/3. So my answer would be B, 1/3. Number 4 says, which distance is longer? 2 1/2 inches, 1 3/4 inches, 2 1/4 inches, or 3/4 inches. For this one, boys and girls, notice that there is a space in between here, and that space is separating your whole number and your fraction. So if you were writing it, you would probably write it like this. Okay, and now they're asking me which distance is longer. Well, I see that 3 of my numbers are greater than 1 because they're a mixed number. So I have a whole number and a fraction. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to eliminate this one because it's less than 1. Now I have 3 choices left. I have 2 1/2, 3 3/4, or 2 1/4. Well, I know that 1 whole is less than 2 wholes, so I'm going to eliminate B, and that leaves me with 2 choices, 2 1/2 and 2 1/4. Since my whole numbers are the same, I have 2 and 2, I'm going to compare the fraction part. I have 1/2 or 1/4. And I know that 1/2 is greater than 1/4 because 1/2 means that you have a whole broken up into 2 parts, and 1/4 means you have a whole broken up into 4 parts. And if you just break them up into 2 parts, those parts are bigger. So 2 1/2 would be the correct answer. And number 5 says, which distance is shorter? So again, I can rewrite my fraction on my notebook if it makes it easier for me to see. And I have 1/4, 1/2, or 3/4. Okay, I know which one I would get rid of. I would eliminate 3/4 because if I'm choosing between 1/4 and 3/4, I know that 3/4 is bigger because it's 3 parts out of 4 instead of 1 part out of 4. So I already know that this one is bigger than 1/4. And now I'm left with 1/4 and 1/2 again. So just to show you a quick model, I'm going to make a rectangle. Now, boys and girls, when you're doing this to compare two fractions, you want to make sure that your whole is the same size. And I'm going to take the first one and I'm going to divide it into 4 equal parts. And I'm going to take the second one and divide it into 2 equal parts. If I shade in 1 part in the first one and 1 part in the second one, I can see that 1/2 is greater than 1/4, therefore 1/4 is shorter. Please turn to page 381 in your books. I would like for you to complete the 2 pages of the Module 13 review. You're going to pause the video here, you're going to complete the pages, and once you're done, you're going to come back to the video so that we can review it together. Welcome back, boys and girls. Let's see how you did. Let's start with the vocabulary. Number 1 says, write each number under the category that it matches. And our categories are fraction greater than 1, mixed number, unit fraction, whole number. And to review the concepts, we know that a fraction greater than 1 is a fraction whose numerator is greater than its denominator. When the numerator is greater than its denominator, it means that you have more parts than you need to make one whole. A mixed number is a number composed of a whole number and a fraction. When you read it, you read the whole number, the word and then the fraction. A unit fraction is 1 part out of the whole. So it's a fraction that has a 1 in the numerator. For example, 1/10. And a whole number is a number that doesn't have any additional parts. So let's take a look at our choices. We'll start with 1/2. Since there's a 1 in the numerator, I know that 1/2 is a unit fraction. It talks about just 1 part out of the whole. The number 4 is a whole number because it doesn't have any additional parts. 1 and 1/3 is a mixed number because you're combining a whole number and a fraction. 11/8 goes in the fraction greater than 1 category because there's more parts than you need to make one whole. 1/4 goes in a unit fraction category. Again, you have 1 part in the numerator. 5/4 is a fraction greater than 1. There's more parts than you need to make a whole. The number 2 goes in whole number. You don't have any additional fractions or parts left over. 3 1/2 goes in a mixed number because it's a whole number and a fraction. And then 1/8 goes in my unit fraction. It's 1 part out of 8. How did you do? Concepts and skills. Number 2, draw lines to divide the shape into eighths. Okay. The most important part, boys and girls, is that when you're dividing your shape, you're making sure there's equal parts. So I like to divide it in half because then I know that each side has to have 4 parts. So you can divide it like this, or let's try another way. Right down the middle, and let's make vertical lines. Okay, 8 parts. And let's try one other way. Oop, let's start with a straight diagonal line. Okay, any of those show eighths. Boys and girls, this works on a square. It would not work on a rectangle. Your parts would not be equal. The bottom says shade 1 part of the shape. Write a fraction that names the shaded part. Well, 1 part is shaded, so that's my numerator. And then there's 8 total parts to make the whole square, so my fraction is 1/8. Number 3, use tools. Each triangle represents half of a whole square. How many triangles do you need to make 7 halves? Tell what strategy or tool you will use to solve the problem. Explain your choice and then find your answer. Well, I know that each part is 1/2. And if I look at my fraction greater than 1, my 7 halves, if each one of these triangles represents 1 part, and I want 7 of them, then I want 7 triangles. But just to be sure, I can go ahead and I can keep drawing my squares and split them into halves until I have my 7 halves. So let's see. So in the first one, I have 2 halves, 3 halves, 4 halves, 5 halves, 6 halves, then I need 1 more half, 7 halves. So I have 7 triangles. Number 4, which fraction names the shaded part? We could start with our numerator or denominator. I'm going to count the shaded parts above, and I'm going to count the total parts below. So the shaded parts, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 shaded parts. And in order to make the entire rectangle, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So my shaded parts are 5/6. 5 parts out of 6 are shaded. Number 5, which fraction is represented by the point on the number line? Before I can tell you what point is here, I need to first find out what my denominator is. So I'm going to count how many equal parts are in one whole. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4 equal parts. So I know my denominator is going to be a 4. I'm counting by fourths. And I know that the dot that I want, the mark, is 1 part. So my numerator is 1 part. So the point is represented by 1/4 on the number line. And number 6, which number line shows 3/3? Well, without even looking at the number lines, I know that 3/3 equals 1 whole because I'm breaking a shape up into 3 equal parts and I'm talking or counting all those parts. So if I'm counting all the parts, then I'm counting the entire thing. So my number line, I'm looking for a point that's on the number 1. And I can see that A has a point on the number 1, so I would select A. And to show you in fractions, we have 1, 2, 3 equal parts. So my denominator is going to be thirds, or 3. And I'm going to start with 0 thirds. My first point would be 1/3, then 2/3, and finally 3/3, or 1 whole. So A is the correct answer. Boys and girls, we're going to answer an extended response problem. And I'm going to model for you my thinking. But before we get to that, let's think of some of the things that we need to keep in mind when we're doing an extended response problem. Okay, we need to make sure we have our 3 reads. Okay, our first read, we're really thinking about the situation. You're making that little movie in your head so that you can understand what's going on. The second read, you're looking at the quantities and what they represent in the problem. And then the final read before you solve the problem is to put everything together and make sure that you understand what is being asked of you. Okay, I want you to focus on one part at a time. If they're asking for you to answer more than one question, answer one part at a time. I want you to organize your work. Remember, if I don't understand where your answers are, no one else will. Okay, and also make sure that you're answering the question. Are you answering what is actually being asked of you? Okay, and when you're finished, you should always look back to see if your work makes sense. Okay, so I'm going to read it to you, and I want you to picture it in your head. Scarlett has 2 same size cakes. She cuts one into 4ths and the other into 6ths. She takes one piece of the cake that is cut into 6ths because she thinks that 1/6 is bigger than 1/4. So I'm picturing Scarlett, I'm picturing 2 round cakes. Mine are frosted in chocolate. And I'm picturing that she takes her first one and she's cutting it into 4 equal parts. And then she takes the other one, that's the same size, and she cuts it into 6 equal parts. Okay, and then she takes the one that's cut into 6 equal parts, one piece of it, because she thinks that 1/6 is bigger than 1/4. Explain the mistake with Scarlett's thinking. Draw a model to help Scarlett understand why her reasoning is incorrect. Well, I'm going to start with the model because that's going to help me to explain why her thinking was incorrect. So that would be my first cake. Okay? And I'm going to cut my first cake into 4ths. So that tells me I'm going to cut it into 4 equal parts. Okay. Now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to take my second cake and I'm going to cut it into 6ths. Okay. And Scarlett goes ahead and she wants to eat one piece of this one. She eats one piece of the 1/6. And she thinks that's bigger because, 6 is bigger than 4. So she thinks 1/6 is bigger than 1/4. Explain the mistake with Scarlett's thinking. Well, I think the mistake with Scarlett's thinking is that she's thinking of a 4 and a 6 as whole numbers instead of as part of a fraction. When you have a fraction, the bigger your denominator is, the smaller each part is going to be. So if I look at my model, I can show that if I cut my first cake into 4 parts and then cut my second cake into 6 parts, the more parts I cut it into, the smaller the pieces become. And just think about it. If you have a cake and I tell you to cut it into 100 equal parts, those parts are going to be really tiny. Okay, so my answer, if I were to go ahead and write my sentences, I would say Scarlett's mistake is is that she thinks of the 4 and 6 as whole numbers. When you have a fraction, the greater the denominator, the smaller each part becomes. Okay, and I would probably label my model to show 1/6 and 1/4. Okay, boys and girls, just want to speak to you about some of the things that I've noticed on the Nearpod activities. Please make sure that you're completing them carefully and answer each question. I see a lot of children leaving some of the questions blank. If it's an open-ended question, you need to type it out and go ahead and answer it. And use paper to solve your problems. I know that when they're multiple choice, I know that you love just picking an answer, but please stop for a minute, do it on paper, and then go back and select your answer. Don't skip any of the problems. Okay, the Nearpod activities do count towards your grade. It shows me that you're completing each math lesson. Okay, and when you sign in, boys and girls, please be sure to sign in with your name. I've seen a lot of names that I can only imagine are probably like mom or dad. So please make sure that you're using your name and you're the one completing the activities. And when I give you the codes, I give you 3 different codes. I give you one in English, one in Portuguese, and one in Spanish. Please be sure that you're completing the English ones unless you're a Tier 1 student. So if you are the students that Ms. Souza or Ms. Cotto gives the test to in Spanish or Portuguese, then you can complete it in the other language. If not, you are only using the English code. Okay? Para os meninos que não entenderam, as atividades do Nearpod, eu tenho visto que alguns de vocês não estão a completar tudo. É muito importante que vocês tomem o seu tempo e completam as perguntas todas. As atividades contam para o vosso grau. Eles mostram a Ms. Souza e a mim que vocês estão a fazer as lições todos os dias e que estão a levar a sério. Quando vocês entrarem no Nearpod, por favor, usem o seu nome. Ok? O vosso nome. Eu tenho muitos nomes que eu não conheço e eu estou a imaginar que são nomes de mães ou de pais. Vocês é que têm que completar as lições e vocês têm que pôr o seu nome. Okay? E quando vocês verem os códigos, por favor, usem o código de português. Se a Ms. Souza dá os trabalhos para vocês em português, por favor, usem só o código de português. Não tem que fazer os 3, só em português. Okay. Niños, cuando ustedes hacen actividades en Nearpod, tienen que tomar su tiempo. Es muy importante para responder a las preguntas todas. Las actividades contan para el grado, muestran a mí y a Ms. Cotto que ustedes están completando los vídeos y las actividades. Cuando ustedes entran para Nearpod, tienen que usar su nombre, su apellido. Hay muchos apellidos que yo no conozco y puede ser apellido de mamá o papá, pero ustedes tienen que por su apellido y ustedes tienen que le completar. Si ustedes están con Ms. Cotto en grupo 1 y Ms. Cotto le da los exámenes en español, por favor, solamente usar el código que dice Spanish. No tiene que hacer en inglés, no tiene que hacer en portugués. Por favor, usen solamente el código de Spanish. Okay, boys and girls, I have your Nearpod codes, but I'm going to do one at a time. Boys and girls, if you are not a Tier 1 student, if Ms. Souza and Ms. Cotto do not give you the tests in Spanish or in Portuguese, then you are using this code on the screen. It is in English. It's VRAUK. You must use that code, and when you log in, please put your name. Okay? Meninos e meninas, se a Miss Souza vos dá os exames em português, por favor, usem o código que eu vou pôr agora em amarelo. É o código para português. MYGLF. Não façam em inglês, façam em português. As perguntas estão traduzidas em português. E, por favor, usem o vosso nome quando entrarem. Niños, si ustedes son grupo 1 con Miss Coro y Miss Coro le da los exámenes en español, por favor, usen solamente el código abajo. ZVIRK. No tiene que hacer en inglés, no tiene que hacer en portugués. Ese código en español, las preguntas están traducidas en español para ustedes. Okay? And my email is on the bottom, boys and girls. I miss you guys, so I would love to get an email from you, even if it's just to say hi. I look forward to hearing from you.